Hello, my name is Phil Kern, Vice President and Trustee on the Board of the Centerville-Washington History, and I am the coordinator of the Centerville-Washington History's monthly speaker series. Unfortunately, due to COVID-19, we are unable to do the live presentations, and therefore we will be filming them in advance for viewing on our CWH webpage and Facebook page. I have the following to report on what's happening at Centerville-Washington History. Since we do not have a December Speaker Series presentation, our next one will be January 19th, when Jeff John will present Governor Cox and the National Road. For your enjoyment, stop by the Ashel Wright Museum Schoolhouse Museum, which is in front, and peek into the window and see what an 1800 schoolroom looked like. There are 2 self-guided videos of Uptown Centerville that have been created for your viewing pleasure. A third one is in progress and will be available soon. They can be found at Centerville-Washington History's webpage. We have a new booklet, a walking tour of historic Centerville, and the booklet has been updated and copies are available at our 3 museums. We have a new exhibit coming soon. It's called A Census Strength, Incredible Women. Watch for announcement on Facebook and web pages. The museum operating hours are Tuesday through Friday from noon to 4. In case you want to visit, we have staff available to help you go through the museums. Also, the curator is available by appointment only. Please see our webpage for a phone number. We are in the process of a purchase program for bricks for our sidewalk around the Walton House. Please see the curator and/or our webpage for further details. Our keynote presenter is D. Ralph Young, who will discuss his time during the Pacific Campaign in World War II, the amphibious march across the Pacific from the Aleutian Islands to Okinawa.
People ask me why I talk about World War II in the Pacific, and especially since I didn't talk about it for 65 years after being discharged from the service, not even to my family, friends, or engineers that I worked with. Why? I don't know why. It just never seemed to be something I wanted to talk about. But about 10 years ago, I noticed that every year we celebrate Normandy, but rarely do we ever hear about Peleliu or Toowoomba or Tinian or Saipan and so forth. So I decided to do something about it and got involved with the help of my wife in writing a book about World War II in the Pacific. So that was the reason that I started my book on World War II in the Pacific. And I can say that first thing I want to do is say nothing that I say is meant to misconstrue the bravery and the sacrifice of all those that fought in the European theater, especially at Normandy. They were a bunch of brave and courageous soldiers. So I just want to make sure that you understand that I'm not demeaning their business. But why is it that we don't talk about the war in the Pacific? And I think it has to do with several things. One is that in Europe, the country, all those sites that you can come upon are very close together. So the tour industry makes it a business to specialize in tours to Europe because the Pacific is so vast that it's very expensive to make tours in the Pacific. And then another thought is that we all immigrated from Europe, so that could have an influence. The other thought is that Eisenhower, being the commander that he was and being our president, was very popular, and that has some influence on the war in Europe. Tell you a little bit about myself. I was born March 4th, 1925 in Lincoln County, Kentucky. I volunteered for the Navy at 17 because I convinced my parents that if I waited until I was drafted, I wouldn't have a choice of where I served, and I didn't want to be in the infantry. So I volunteered at 17, but actually I was 18 when I went to war because they allowed me to finish high school. And then I spent my early days at the Great Lakes training camp. I went on to the Pacific and served on the USS J Franklin Bell for about 3 years. And then I was discharged from the Navy in January of 1946. And I graduated from the University of Kentucky and with a BS in electrical engineering in 1953. Then my career was with developing power projects all over the U.S. and all over Southeast Asia and the Middle East. I was fortunate to be inducted into the University of Kentucky College of Engineering Hall of Distinction in 2006. And then I authored 3 books. My first book was The Power of a Mother's Prayer, and I wrote that book because when I went off to the war, I remember my mom sitting on the front porch with tears running down her cheeks and saying, "Don't worry, Ralph, I'll be praying for you." Well, unfortunately, she passed away before I was discharged from the Navy, but I knew that she was praying for me. So I had to write a book about the power of a mother's prayer. And then my first wife, Charlotte, passed away in 2006. And then in 2007, I met up with Janice Chappell, and she became my wife. And she's the real reason that I wrote the books, because she helped me immensely. About World War II, there were 16 million of us in the war during World War II. And at the end of 2019, there was 389,000 left, and we were dying at a rate of about 300 a day. Now, if the 300 a day continues, that means in 2020 we're going to have about 110,000 more deaths of World War II vets. So that means we're less than 200,000 today in number of veterans still alive who fought in World War II. American casualties. In the European theater, there were 135,000 deaths, and there were 104,000 in the Pacific. The missing was not too many missing in Europe, but you have to remember all of our invasions in the Pacific were in isolated places and had to go in over water, and as I'll show you later on how we made it ashore, you'll understand why so many were missing. It's also shocking to note that overall there were some like 96 million people lost during World War II, civilians and military. This will give you an idea of what the empire of Japanese was. Starting in about 1870, they started an expansion program, and they expanded rather rapidly, but then after December the 7th, 1941, the purple shows you what they occupied and what we had before us to conquer and get to Japan. So there were several reasons for going to Japan, and the most demanding was MacArthur. As you know, he was a very demanding commander and a very good one, but he insisted upon the trip to Japan to go through the Philippines. Nimitz and Halsey and Spruance kept preventing the mid-Pacific, across Central Pacific. They met in Hawaii and with high-ranking officials and came to a decision that really there were three paths across. The one on the north would be one that we wouldn't follow through, only to just establish a defensive position, and that was Admiral Kincaid was responsible for that. Then Pruitt and Halsey and Nimitz took through Tawau, Saipan, and Peleliu, and then MacArthur wanted the Guadalcanal through Leyte and Luzon in the Philippines and on to Japan. So one of the first things I saw when I started researching for the book was a picture of Richard Cross. Richard is an 18-year-old Marine from Minneapolis, Minnesota. He was experiencing his first battle in the Battle of Peleliu in November of 1944, and he was in the midst of a terrific battle. The commanding officer could hardly talk because of the deafening sound of the battle, hand grenades and mortar fire and gunfire. So he said, I need a four-man detail to go to the front lines and bring back a wounded comrade. So the four-man stretcher detail headed out to the front lines, and on the way, the gunfire and the bullets became so severe they had to take cover in a foxhole. And then the lightened up for a moment, and they saw two people coming toward them. They demanded a password, and they didn't get a password. They got a hand grenade thrown into the midst of them. And Richard Cross, 18-year-old Marine, looks like a kid, and he fell on that hand grenade and took the sole blast of the explosion to save his comrades. So that's the kind of people that I serve with, and I'm proud to have been there. And then there's, again, other people that look very young. That's myself and the group that I serve with on the ship, which is the gunner's mates on the USS J. Franklin Bell. The J. Franklin Bell, as you can see below, is camouflaged to try to avoid detection. And the purpose of the APAs, it's Amphibious Personnel Assault, is to pick up the troops at their base and land them on the island to be invaded, then supply the troops with material equipment needed to meet battle conditions. To accomplish this, the APAs would send with each beach party, would send a beach party with the invasion forces to be there to repair the guns or boats that might have trouble, and also to keep the supplies moved away from the beach so that it didn't get congested. Then I wanted to tell you about a person that I researched and found out about. His name is Jacob Volzez. He was a native of Guadalcanal. He was educated in the South Seas Missionary School in the Solomon Islands. And then he served about 25 years as a police officer in the Solomon Islands. Then he retired and went back to his home in Guadalcanal. In doing so, he became a coast watcher. The Australians established something that came very beneficial to the American forces, and that is coast watchers. Coast watchers were missionaries or farmers or people who lived and worked in the Guadalcanal area and would report to Australia on a frequency that was established for them to communicate of any unusual activities going on. So they were used tremendous value because they were able to identify planes that were heading toward Guadalcanal or any other island, and the people who were there would be able to be ready with their anti-aircraft fire But Jacob was converted to Christianity, and he took the name of Jacob. And when he retired to Guadalcanal, he then, as I said, became a coast watcher. He also, in doing that, the WASP had a plane to go down, and a pilot parachuted into the jungles on Guadalcanal. And Jacob found him before the Japanese did and led him back to the American forces where he could be rescued. So he then got captured by the Japanese, Jacob did, and then they tied him up with the ropes to a tree and tried their best to get him to tell about where the Americans were and what their strengths were. But he refused, and they tortured him. And finally, the commanding officer of the Japanese says, "Don't shoot him because they'll give away our position, but bayonet him to death." So he was bayoneted in the stomach, in the cheeks, in the shoulder, left for dead by the Japanese. He chewed through the ropes that had him bound and crawled through the jungle to the American forces and told them about the Japanese that were getting ready to attack them, and gave them time to put up their defensive position, and actually resulted in a successful defensive by the American forces. So that's the type of people that helped win World War II. The U.S. really started World War II in the Aleutian Islands and Solomon Islands. And you have to remember that was in August of 1943. And that's only 7 months about after Pearl Harbor. So our troops were not seasoned, they were not well trained, and were not well provided with the latest guns and equipment. But they had to go with what they had. In the killed to wounded ratio, to give you the idea of the type of people we fought as the Japanese, our ratio of, for every 1 killed, we had 3 wounded. For the Japanese, it was just the opposite. For every 1 wounded, there were 18 killed, meaning that they just didn't give up. And as a result of that, we were 5 times more likely to be killed, according to the Pacific Online Encyclopedia, and 3 times more likely to be wounded, and twice as likely to end up being a POW. Another thing to point out the difference between the enemy we fought and what the Europeans fought. The Europeans, under the Germans and Italians, the death rate of POW was about 1%. For the Pacific, with the Japanese, the death rate was over 40%. And veterans buried on foreign soil. At Normandy, we have 9,400. The American Theater in American Cemetery in Manila, we have 17,000. And every president since Carter has visited Normandy, but only Obama and Clinton have visited Manila Cemetery in Manila. I think it has something to do with Normandy being close to Paris rather than Manila, so I think that influences some of them too. Another fellow that impressed me was Lieutenant John Waldron. Had a squadron of 30 planes on the Hornet, and that means that there were 30 men because each one plane had a gunner's mate. This is a picture of the 15 pilots that were in his squadron, and the center picture circled is a fellow by the name of George Gay. George Gay was shot down, and he managed to crash his plane into the middle of the Japanese fleet and escaped. In doing so, he took a cushion out of the plane and held it over his head because the Japanese Navy were gunning everything that saw move. And so he hid under that cushion. He could even see the faces of some of the Japanese, but they couldn't see him. So he stayed there for 30 hours. And then finally, the Japanese fleet moved on, and Americans came in with a PVY plane and they spotted him and brought him back to safety. So he lived to be 77 years old, spent 30 years flying for TWA. And then when he died at age 77, his wife fulfilled his wishes of being cremated and taking his ashes back to the Battle of Midway and spread them over the area where the battle was fought so he could join his comrades. Again, some of the heroes of World War II. Total Medal of Honors during World War II were 464, posthumously 266. There were 197 in Pacific Theater, 267 in the European Theater. This is what the battleground looked like when I approached the beach in Saipan in June 15, 1944. And this gives you an idea. The top, you see the offloading of the troops going onto the beach. And that's why so many drownings occurred that we never came up with the recognition of what happened to them. So they ended up being classified as mission. I happened to go back to Saipan in 2017. Janice and I went back and was able to visit the battleground where I fought. I'm standing on the area there in the center of where I was during the war. And some more heroes of the battle. William O'Brien from Troy, New York. He was a short individual, very energetic and very active, and his people worshipped him. They thought he was an ideal service leader. And he, in the early battles of Saipan, he was in battle, and happened that the tanks became disoriented and started firing on his own men. So he ran across the open field under fire. He first tried to make radio contact and couldn't. And then he ran across the field and he jumped onto that tank and hammered on the turret with his pistol and got him turned around. He then, later on, when the Japanese made their final thrust with a 5,000 banzai charge against all, he ran up and down the line with his 245s, firing away, yelling to his troops, and then he ran out of ammunition with his pistols. He picked up a rifle from a wounded soldier, continued firing. He then ran out of ammunition with the rifle. He mounted a Jeep and fired a 50 caliber machine gun. And when they found him, he was killed in that position, but around him was littered bodies of Japanese. And that was one of the other fellow in that same battle was Thomas Baker. Thomas was also from Troy, New York, and he was assigned to bringing up the rear of this group of men because the Japanese would, late in battle in the Pacific, they chose to let the Americans get onto the beach, and then they set up a very defensive cross-firing, and with tunnels and trenches were able to sneak around behind the American troops and come up from behind. So he was assigned as a rear guard. He had firsthand by himself destroyed 2 encampments of about 15 Japanese soldiers. And then late in the battle, the unit said that we should fall back for the night to a better defensive position. And Thomas got wounded. Corpsman was trying to get him back, and the corpsman got wounded. And then Thomas said, "Don't bother, I'm done for. Just prop me up against that tree and leave me alone and give me a cigarette." So he gave him a cigarette, propped him up against a tree, gave him a pistol with 8 rounds. The next morning, as the unit moved forward, after taking their defensive position overnight, they came upon Thomas still leaning up against a tree, and the pistol was on the ground. The cigarette butt was clinging from his lips, but 8 Japanese were laying around him. And for that, he was awarded the Medal of Honor. So was William Baker, the one I previously talked about. He was also, William O'Brien was also given the Congressional Medal of Honor. The next battle was Tinian. Tinian is about 14 miles long and about 4 miles wide. And the battle plan was to fake a landing on the south, where there was only one good beach, and that was on south, which is called Tinian Town. And me and the beach party that were active on Saipan were transferred to another ship, and we were brought in with the troops in the invasion force, and we attacked a northern beach, which was not very well suited for a beach and had a lot of coral. And one of my duties and the group that I was with was to bring in a pier that we swam in and brought the pier over so that we could stretch out over the coral and land the troops. So the fake landing on the south was done by my ship and some others, and it worked. It moved, the Japanese moved their troops south. And with Tinian being only about 4 miles wide, our ships and our battleships and cruisers and destroyers offline were able to keep them pinned down so that they didn't get back to the north. So we really landed on a minimum amount of gunfire, which was great. This is the site of Beach 1, White Beach 1 on Tinian. You can see all the rough coral that's around. That's why we had to take in the pier to try to breach over it. When the local people, Janice and I and several more, went back to Saipan, and when the local people found that I was in the D-Day invasion of both Saipan and Tinian, they said to us, tomorrow is going to have a ceremony at the American Cemetery, and we'd like for all of you to attend. So our group leader said, we'll be there. So the next day we went to a couple places, but we ended up for this ceremony, and when we got there, they asked me to step forward, and I was shocked, and they read a citation thanking me for being in the invasion of Saipan and Tinian, and the inscription on the medal says, "Our grateful islands remember." And they just treated us like kings. I never would have been so honored in my life, so it was a great thrill and something I'll never forget. This is a group that we visited, and everywhere we went, they wanted to shake hands and hug and give us kisses. So just was a great time and great feeling. You may have read or seen the movie Hacksaw Ridge. It's about Desmond Doss. Desmond Doss was a fighter who wanted to serve in the war, but he was a conscientious objector and he wouldn't carry a gun, or he wouldn't fire a gun. And he had to battle to keep himself in the Army because it just didn't go over well with some of those tough sergeants that thought he was just using it as an excuse. But he was in the Battle of Okinawa, and when he went into battle, they had to attack a high ridge, and it was about 400 feet tall. It's a ridge that Janice and I are standing by the rock where he lowered about 75 men over that cliff. There's a cliff just to the left of us, and that's where he spent the time getting wounded people from the battlefield and taking them back to that point and lowering them with a rope and stretcher over the cliff to the men that would treat them below. So for that, he was given the Medal of Honor. This is a picture of Okinawa. My duty at Okinawa was laying smoke screens. This was in the time that Japanese had resorted to kamikaze planes. So our defense against kamikaze planes was to hide from them. To hide from them, they would get a group of us, must have been 30 or 40 different boats, loaded with smoke pots that we just traversed the area and laid a smoke screen and hid the ships underneath it. We came upon a new battle or gunship from the U.S. and the ensign that was in my boat had a light. We were supposed to fire our light to show that we were friendly forces. He inadvertently dropped the light just at a crucial moment, and they opened fire on us. So we all dove to the bilges of the plane or the boat we were on, and the ensign got the letter, got the flashlight, and showed and stopped the firing. It was their first experience in battle in the Pacific as gunboat, and they were scared. They were really embarrassed that they'd been firing on us, but it really wasn't their fault. And they took us aboard and treated us like royalty. On Tinian, there you see an encampment that shows how the atom bomb was loaded onto the different planes. It's a monument, and it works like when you take your car to the garage and they put it on a jack and they raise it up to get under it. That's the same method they used to bring up the atom bombs into the bomb base of the different planes. This is probably the most famous runway in the world. It's called Runway Able. It's on the island of Tinian, only about 100 yards from the beach where we landed with White Beach 1. On July the 24th, which was 8 days after we invaded Tinian, 8,000 of the 8,800 Japanese troops on the island were dead. 4 months later, the Seabees had converted this airfield to the busiest airfield of World War II. And then on August 6, 1945, Colonel Paul Tibbets left this runway with an A-bomb for Hiroshima. 3 days later, Major Chuck Sweeney left the same runway for Kokura. Finding cloud cover over Kokura, he went on to the backup target of Nagasaki. This, as I say, could be the most historical airstrip on the face of the earth, because 16 hours after Nagasaki, the Emperor of Japan, without consulting anyone, decided to end the war. And I say, yes, killing 120 to 140,000 people with 2 bombs sounds awful. But the officials that were planning for the invasion of Japan had ordered 1.5 million Purple Hearts. Purple Hearts are awarded on the battlefield. So that meant if they were going to have 1.5 million wounded, they were expecting at least 500,000 American deaths. And just remember, surrendering was not an option with the Japanese. So the A-bomb brought Japan out of a barbaric society into the 20th century and to a government that was controlled by the people. With the U.S. help, Japan became one of the prosperous nations in the world after World War II. Today, it is the only nation in the world that has passports that are accepted in 190 of the 195 nations. This is a picture of the signing of surrender of the Japanese aboard the USS Missouri. Why did you choose the battleship for surrounding? It was purely symbolism. Nothing says you were defeated more than having to board the enemy ship in your own harbor. And why was the U.S. Missouri chose? Truman was president at the time, and he made that decision because he was from Missouri. And when the delegation came aboard, the U.S. arranged it so it made it most difficult for them to get to, because one of the main senior members of the Japanese group had lost a leg during an assassination attempt, so they knew it would make it difficult for him. And they turned the number 1 and 2 turrets for the 16-inch guns in a direction that was actually right overhead of the Japanese group. This was literally saying to them, "You're signing this under the gun." And the honor guard for the sailors were handpicked to all of them to be over 6 feet tall. And after the ceremony, the Japanese were not invited to tea, and over 400 military aircraft flew overhead to emphasize the American strength. Next slide is my passion really is to tell the world about what my comrades went through during the war in the Pacific. And I'm really dedicating myself to doing that. As long as I live, I'm going to keep preaching it, because they were such a great group of people, and they brought me and a lot of other people on their coattails into the greatest generation, for which I'm extremely proud that I served.